You have been told that aged cheese is a guilty pleasure, high in saturated fat, high in sodium, something you allow yourself occasionally and quietly feel bad about afterward. Every major health organization for the past 40 years has told a consistent story. Limit saturated fat, limit full-fat dairy, choose the low-fat version. Here is the problem with that story. France has the highest per capita cheese consumption in the developed world and one of the lowest rates of cardiovascular mortality. The longest-lived populations on Earth include fermented dairy in their daily diets. And the molecule in aged cheese that anti-aging researchers are currently most focused on is not a fat at all. It is a polyamine called spermidine, present in aged cheddar, Gouda, and Parmesan at concentrations high enough to register as a meaningful daily dose. This video is not about giving you permission to eat cheese. It is about understanding why 40 years of dietary science got cheese specifically wrong, what the food matrix mechanism actually is, and what the evidence says about the compounds that make aged cheese biologically distinct from every other saturated fat source in your diet. In 1958, a physiologist named Ancel Keys proposed that dietary saturated fat raised blood cholesterol, and that higher blood cholesterol caused cardiovascular disease. It became one of the most influential hypotheses in the history of nutrition. It also became official United States dietary policy in 1980, when the first dietary guidelines for Americans told the public to avoid too much fat, saturated fat, and cholesterol. Here is what that 1980 policy was built on. Keys had collected dietary and mortality data from 22 countries. When he published his landmark analysis, he used data from 7. The 15 countries he did not include happened to contain some of the most inconvenient data points for his hypothesis: France and Switzerland, which had among the highest saturated fat consumption in the world and among the lowest cardiovascular death rates. The omission has since been documented in multiple scientific reviews as a methodological bias that allowed correlation from a non-random country selection to drive 4 decades of global dietary guidance. The consequences of that guidance were not neutral. When food manufacturers removed fat from products to meet the new low-fat standard, they replaced it with refined carbohydrates and partially hydrogenated vegetable oils. Those hydrogenated oils contained trans fatty acids. Trans fats were later confirmed to raise LDL cholesterol and lower HDL cholesterol at rates significantly worse than the saturated fats they had replaced. The dietary intervention designed to reduce cardiovascular risk introduced a fat that increased it. A 2022 analysis published in the British Medical Journal reviewing 29 prospective cohorts with more than 1 million participants found that reducing saturated fat intake showed little or no difference in all-cause mortality. The model had been applied globally for 40 years before the large-scale evidence base it required was assembled. When that evidence arrived, it did not support the original prediction. The reason cheese behaves differently from every other saturated fat source has a name. It is called the food matrix effect. The food matrix is the physical and chemical structure within which nutrients arrive in your digestive system. The same molecule behaves differently depending on the biological vehicle it travels in. Saturated fatty acids in butter arrive as free fat. Saturated fatty acids in aged cheese arrive embedded inside a protein casein network, physically integrated with calcium phosphate nanoclusters, fermentation-derived peptides, and bioactive compounds produced by the bacterial cultures that age the cheese. That is not the same delivery vehicle, and the difference in that vehicle changes what actually reaches your bloodstream. Here is the mechanism. When you digest aged cheese, the calcium phosphate in the cheese matrix enters your small intestine alongside the released fatty acids. Calcium binds to those fatty acids and forms insoluble compounds called calcium soaps. Calcium soaps cannot be absorbed. They pass through the intestinal wall and are excreted. Multiple randomized controlled trials have now demonstrated that subjects consuming identical saturated fat content as cheese versus butter show significantly less LDL cholesterol rise in the cheese condition, with measurably higher fecal fat excretion confirming that less saturated fat is entering circulation. The saturated fat content printed on the nutrition label of aged cheese does not represent the saturated fat that actually reaches your blood. The matrix intercepts a meaningful portion of it before absorption occurs. The second mechanism operates through a compound produced during the fermentation and aging process itself. As cheese ages, bacterial cultures metabolizing the protein matrix produce menaquinone, the long-chain form of vitamin K2. Menaquinone activates a protein called matrix GLA protein, which prevents calcium from depositing inside arterial walls. The Rotterdam study, covering nearly 5,000 participants over 8 to 11 years, found that higher dietary menaquinone intake was associated with a 50% reduction in arterial calcification and a 25% reduction in all-cause mortality. Menaquinone intake was associated with a reduced risk of coronary heart disease. Phylloquinone, the plant-based form of vitamin K1, showed no comparable association. The protective signal was specific to the fermentation-derived form. The fermentation process that ages cheese is simultaneously building spermidine, building vitamin K2, reducing fat bioavailability through calcium saponification, and producing butyrate, a short-chain fatty acid that inhibits inflammatory gene expression through histone deacetylase suppression. These are not independent nutritional coincidences. They are the coordinated biological output of microbial metabolism, a food system that evolved over centuries, before the nutrition label existed to reduce it to a single saturated fat number. Fresh cheese contains almost no spermidine. Mozzarella, ricotta, cottage cheese, and cream cheese deliver negligible amounts regardless of their protein or fat content. The spermidine in aged cheese is not present in the milk it was made from. It is manufactured during the aging process by the bacterial cultures that transform fresh curd into a mature fermented food. Here is the mechanism. The starter cultures and secondary bacteria in aging cheese express enzymes called ornithine, decarboxylase, and spermidine synthase. These enzymes convert free amino acids released during protein breakdown into putrescine first and then into spermidine. As the cheese ages, two things compound simultaneously. The bacterial population continues to metabolize and produce spermidine, and ongoing proteolysis continuously releases new amino acid substrates for that production. The result is a progressive accumulation. The longer the aging duration, the higher the spermidine concentration, not because the cheese is absorbing spermidine from somewhere, but because it is manufacturing more of it internally with each additional week of fermentation. The practical output of this mechanism is a hierarchy worth understanding before your next grocery purchase. Fresh cheese in the 0 to 4 week range delivers under 0.5 milligram of spermidine per 100 grams. Young-aged varieties between 3 and 6 months deliver 2 to 5 milligrams. Medium-aged varieties between 6 and 12 months deliver 5 to 10 milligrams. Well-aged hard cheeses at 18 months and beyond, including aged cheddar, Parmigiano Reggiano, aged Gouda, and Comté, reach 10 to 20 milligrams per 100 grams, placing them among the most spermidine-concentrated foods in the standard Western diet. A 30-gram daily serving of aged cheddar at 18 months delivers approximately 4 to 6 milligrams of spermidine. That is a meaningful daily contribution to the intake level that the Bruneck 20-year cohort associated with lower all-cause mortality, delivered through a food most people already have in their refrigerator, but have been told to feel guilty about eating. The mechanism explains why cheese behaves differently. The epidemiology shows what that difference looks like across decades of real human outcomes. The Bruneck study followed 829 adults for 20 years and measured dietary spermidine intake across the full diet, including contributions from fermented foods and aged cheese. The hazard ratio for all-cause mortality per 1 standard deviation increase in dietary spermidine intake was 0.76 after full adjustment for age, sex, caloric intake, lifestyle factors, and established mortality predictors. Translated from statistical language, higher dietary spermidine, including from cheese-derived sources, was independently associated with a 26% lower risk of dying from any cause over 20 years after accounting for every major confounding variable the researchers could measure. The NHANES analysis published in Frontiers in Public Health extended this finding to 23,894 adults in the United States from 2003 to 2014. Among the 11 specific food sources of spermidine analyzed, cheese-derived spermidine specifically was significantly associated with reduced cardiovascular mortality, with a hazard ratio of 0.68 for cardiovascular mortality and 0.70 for all-cause mortality in the highest versus lowest intake group. Cheese-derived spermidine was one of 5 food categories out of 11 tested to reach statistical significance for both mortality outcomes. A 2025 global meta-analysis published in Nature Communications analyzed dairy consumption and cardiovascular disease incidence, finding that high-fat cheese consumption above half a serving per day was associated with lower risk of cardiovascular disease and coronary heart disease. The protective signal was stronger for high-fat cheese than for low-fat cheese for the primary cardiovascular endpoints. Recent meta-analyses pooling data across dozens of cohort studies have consistently found that fermented dairy consumption is associated with lower all-cause cardiovascular and cancer mortality across independent population samples. Here is what the data does not tell us. Every one of these studies is observational. Higher cheese consumption may co-occur with other protective dietary behaviors. No randomized controlled trial has isolated aged cheese as an intervention and measured longevity outcomes. The mechanisms are established. The epidemiological direction is consistent across study designs, populations, and decades. The direct causal trial does not yet exist. That is the honest scientific position. Aged cheese fits into this system differently from wheat germ, fasting, and mushrooms. It is not a 3 times per week bolus. It is a daily background layer that delivers continuous low-level spermidine input to complement and extend the higher dose delivery from wheat germ. The daily target is 25 to 40 grams of a well-aged hard cheese. At 30 grams, which is roughly the size of a matchbox or a generous garnish on pasta, you are delivering approximately 4 to 6 milligrams of spermidine as a daily contribution. That 30-gram portion also stays within reasonable daily sodium limits for most healthy adults, adding approximately 120 to 200 milligrams of sodium to the diet. Well inside the 2,300 milligram daily ceiling. Variety selection determines how much spermidine your 30 grams actually delivers. The highest producing category is hard-aged cheeses at 18 months or beyond. Aged cheddar at 18 to 24 months, Parmigiano Reggiano at 24 months, Conte at 12 to 24 months, and aged Gouda at 18 months are your primary choices. Gruyere and Pecorino Romano are strong secondary options in the 10 to 12 month range. Avoid using fresh mozzarella, ricotta, brie, or cream cheese as your primary spermidine source from dairy. The fermentation aging window that produces spermidine has not been completed in those varieties. Timing relative to the fasting window does not require strategic placement the way wheat germ does. Spermidine from cheese enters the same EP300 inhibition pathway regardless of when you consume it. Included in your breakfast meal. in your last meal before the fasting window, or as a mid-afternoon element. Consistency across the week matters more than exact placement within the day. The most effective practical integration is pairing aged cheese with your wheat germ serving in the same meal. 2 tablespoons of wheat germ delivering 7 milligrams of spermidine plus 30 grams of aged cheddar, delivering 4 to 6 milligrams, places your total single-meal spermidine input at 11 to 13 milligrams from 2 independent food matrix sources. That single meal delivers a spermidine input at or above the highest dietary turtle from the Bruneck cohort before the rest of the day's diet is added. Full-fat yogurt with 2 tablespoons of wheat germ, 30 grams of grated aged cheddar or Parmigiano stirred into a vegetable dish, and 80 grams of tempeh covers the wheat germ pathway, the fermented dairy pathway, and the fermented soy pathway simultaneously in one structured last meal before your fasting window. Before this video ends, 3 things that most longevity content about cheese does not tell you. First, individual LDL response to dairy fat is genetically variable. Approximately 25% of the population carries the APOE epsilon 4 genetic variant, which produces a significantly larger LDL cholesterol increase in response to saturated fat from any source, including cheese. If you have had genetic testing and know your APOE status, or if your LDL has historically risen sharply with full-fat dairy, run a lipid panel 4 to 6 weeks after adding daily aged cheese, and let your own biology inform the decision. Population averages do not override individual data. Second, aged hard cheeses are high-sodium foods. Individuals managing hypertension, chronic kidney disease, or taking ACE inhibitors should account for the sodium contribution of a daily cheese portion within their total dietary sodium budget. Comté is the lowest sodium option among the high spermidine varieties if sodium management is a priority. Third, aged cheese is one layer of a multi-source dietary system. Everything this video established about spermidine and longevity is built on habitual dietary patterns across multiple food groups observed over decades. No single food produces the outcome. The system produces the outcome. The cheese paradox was never a paradox. It was a prediction failure from a food model that treated a nutrition label as a complete biological description. The saturated fat number on aged cheese does not capture the calcium phosphate matrix that intercepts a portion of that fat before it reaches your bloodstream. It does not capture the menaquinone produced during fermentation that protects arterial walls from calcification. It does not capture the spermidine accumulated through 24 months of bacterial metabolism that activates the same autophagy gene program as the wheat germ in the first video of this series. The label reduced a biological system to a single number, and dietary guidelines built on that reduction told millions of people to avoid a food that multiple independent mechanisms suggest they should have been eating. Here is the complete 4-layer system this series has now established. Every day, 2 tablespoons of wheat germ and 30 grams of well-aged hard cheese, delivering 11 to 13 milligrams of combined spermidine as your daily autophagy gene program input. 5 days per week, a 16-hour fasting window initiated after a spermidine-loaded last meal, activating the mTOR suppression signal that converts gene program into active cellular cleanup. 3 days per week, 100 grams of shiitake or oyster mushrooms, activating the NRF2 pathway that protects mitochondria during that cleanup and directs the autophagy machinery to its highest priority targets. 4 inputs, 4 mechanistically distinct pathways, 1 integrated system that traditional dietary cultures assembled before the molecular research existed to explain why it worked. If you are adding aged cheese to your daily protocol starting this week, comment matrix below. That word tells us this video delivered the mechanism, and it tells us which video to build next. The fifth video in this series asks the question that all 4 previous videos have been building toward. When you run all 4 pathways simultaneously over months, what does the measurable biological change actually look like? And what does peer-reviewed research say you can realistically expect and when? That video covers biological age testing, autophagy, flux markers, and the honest timeline of cellular change. It is already on your screen,